5 battleships had already fired at the mountain. Cruisers had taken their turn after that. Carrier aircraft came over in waves. Rocket ships worked the shoreline until the ridges vanished behind smoke and pulverized coral. Offshore observers counted impacts by the hundreds. Marines waiting in the landing craft watched whole sections of hillside seem to collapse into themselves. Minutes later, the first assault waves crossed the reef, and the mountains started firing. Not one gun, not one bunker. An entire rock face that looked ruined beyond use suddenly opened from a dozen hidden points. Someone in the first wave shouted, "Where is it coming from?" No one could answer. Inside a limestone chamber above the western beaches of Saipan, Colonel Harada Kenji sat beside a table map, weighted down with pistol magazines and a canteen cup. Dust shook loose with every heavy shell. A signalman looked up from the field telephone and waited. Harada did not flinch. The chamber had been cut deep enough to outlast fear. So had the galleries behind it, and the ammunition recesses, and the narrow sleeping shelves, and the vent shafts disguised from the air. The bombardment could batter entrances, bury a gun crew, close one passage. It could not see the whole mountain. Harada touched the map. "Wait," the signalman nodded. The guns stayed silent. Private Danny Mercer had been told the bombardment would do most of the work before the ramps dropped. No one had said it exactly that way. No officer was careless enough for that. But the fleet offshore was so large, the shelling so relentless, the aircraft so constant, that every man in Danny's landing craft had quietly built the same private picture in his head. Burned trees, flattened positions, a stunned defense. Bad ground, maybe, but not a living fortress. He clutched his rifle between his knees and watched the beach approach through spray and smoke. The coxswain yelled, the ramp banged down, and somewhere ahead, invisible at first, machine gun rounds began stitching the water. Harada had not built his defense for a shoreline spectacle. The old way had become too expensive. The Americans landed with too much naval support, too much air cover, and too much tonnage behind them. A beach defense that spent itself in the surf, made for brave reports and short battles. Saipan was not meant to be short. His engineers had shaped the hill country into layers. Firing chambers, crawl passages, observation cuts, reserve niches, command pockets. Some galleries linked laterally across ridges. Others climbed into reverse slopes and dropped back into lower chambers. A shell might close one entrance. Another mouth would remain. Harada glanced at the field clock. Not yet. Outside, the fleet kept firing. The illusion lasted until the first Marines hit dry sand. Danny ran 5 steps, fell flat behind a wrecked timber, and looked inland through smoke that kept thinning and reforming in the wind. The ridgeline ahead seemed broken and empty. Palm stumps stood like blackened poles. Coral shelves showed through the earth where heavy shells had chewed the surface away. A lieutenant pointed toward the slope and waved 2 squads forward. The men rose. Halfway across the open stretch, fire ripped out of the rock from 3 different heights. Danny saw one Marine spin and fall. Another disappeared behind a blast of white coral dust. The ridge had not survived by accident. It had been waiting. Marine headquarters had prepared for fortifications. Saipan was revealing something narrower and harder. Positions were not simply reinforced. They were hidden inside the island's own structure. Early field messages reaching command posts along the beachhead described fire from apertures not visible from offshore, mortars believed destroyed, reopening from inland folds, and machine guns apparently protected by cave or tunnel arrangement. The wording was cautious because no one yet had a complete picture. Observation aircraft circled. Naval guns shifted inland. Rifle companies kept moving. The puzzle remained. Where exactly had all that pre-landing fire gone? Harada lifted the receiver when the first report came in from a coast observer. Americans ashore in force. How far? Harada asked, still sorting on the beach. Some movement toward the first ridge. They think the northern chambers are dead. Harada listened without expression. The observer kept talking, voice thin with line noise and distant shell impacts. They are standing where the central gallery can see them. Harada set the receiver down and turned to the artillery officer in the chamber beside him. Central gallery first, mortars after. The officer bowed once and moved away. The mountain had listened long enough. Captain Robert Haynes spent the first afternoon on Saipan discovering how useless visible destruction could be. From a distance, one cut in the coral face looked shattered clean through. The opening had been hit by naval fire, then strafed, then bracketed by mortars from the beachhead. Haynes sent a squad toward it because every instinct he had said that no crew could still be alive inside. The fire did not come from that opening. It came from a slit 10 yards higher, another lower down, and a third farther left where the coral shadow hid a recess no one had marked. His men threw themselves flat among the rocks. The shattered opening remained silent. The living parts of the position had never been where the bombardment thought they were. By dusk, battalion journals were already noting the same unwelcome pattern in different sectors. Positions believed wrecked were reopening only after infantry exposed themselves to take the ground in front of them. Some cave mouths were decoys. Some were living chambers. Some belonged to systems extending behind the face and out to side apertures. A ridge that looked neutralized from the sea could still hold an untouched defense inside. Nobody on the first day had time to reduce that into doctrine. They reduced it into language. The hill is honeycombed. Fire comes out of nowhere. We kill one opening, and another one wakes up. Saipan was teaching quickly. Sergeant Sam Velez received his first call forward just before sunset. The lieutenant who found him looked too relieved. "Cave mouth up the slope," he said. "They can't get near it." Sam shifted the fuel tank straps across his shoulders and followed. The opening, when he finally saw it, did not look like much. A dark crescent under a lip of rock. Riflemen nearby had been firing into it off and on for nearly an hour. A barman lay behind a coral hump covering a side drawer. No one had gone closer than 30 yards. "Think that's the only mouth?" Sam asked. The lieutenant hesitated. "That's the one shooting." Sam kept looking. On islands like this, those were never the same thing. Harada had expected flamethrowers eventually. They had appeared often enough elsewhere that only a fool would leave them out of his planning. His confidence came from the depth behind the visible openings. Flame could reach into a chamber. It could fill a bend, force men back, ignite stored material, close a firing recess for minutes or hours. The tunnel system had been designed to survive the first solution the enemy found. Each position commander had standing instructions. If flame came, fall deeper. If one mouth failed, reopen another. If heat forced a withdrawal, wait for the Americans to rise. Harada did not regard the weapon lightly. He simply did not think it was the final answer. Sam Velez dropped behind a coral fold and traced the slope with his eyes. One cave mouth. Obvious. One broken crack higher up with a suspicious angle. A shallow depression left of the main opening, where the ridge bent out of sight. He asked for covering fire on all three. The lieutenant frowned. "We don't know the other two are alive." Sam nodded toward the silent crack. "That's why they might be." The firing started again from the main mouth before the argument could continue. This time the lieutenant just nodded. Minutes later, the ridge was alive with marine rifles, a machine gun hammering into the higher crack, and a flamethrower operator inching forward under the noise of every other weapon in reach. Danny Mercer watched the whole attack from 20 yards away and learned more in 30 seconds than he had in weeks of training. Sam rose, braced, and sent flame into the main opening in one steady orange stream. Smoke blew back. Someone shouted. A few men around Danny started lifting themselves, ready to move. Then shots cracked from the higher crack, exactly where Sam had pointed. A corporal swore and dragged one man flat by the web gear. The main opening stayed silent. The upper slit kept firing. By the time darkness settled across the slope, nobody on that ridge believed one cave meant one problem anymore. Harada was pleased with the report. The main chamber is scorched. The upper recess still active. Americans held below the shelf. Good enough. He had not asked his men to stop the landing forever. He had asked them to keep breaking rhythm. American infantry wanted cause and effect. Bombardment, advance, seizure, progress. The cave defense cut those lines apart. One mouth silenced. Another alive. One ridge climbed. Another chamber opens behind it. One weapon brought forward. A support route unseen from below. In the chamber, his chief engineer unrolled a second map, showing reserve passages through the limestone. Harada studied it and asked the question he kept asking. Where will they think the mountain ends? On Saipan, The first answer arrived from men who did not usually get top billing in battle plans. Engineers. Not all at once. Not in a grand conference that night. More quietly. One officer asking for dozers closer to the line. Another wondering if blocked entrances were better than entered ones. A platoon sergeant noting that a cave mouth mattered less if the slope below it could be reshaped. A tank lieutenant asking whether coral rubble could be pushed into openings too narrow to assault safely. By the second week, those thoughts were appearing in more notebooks. The Marines had not solved the cave war. They had started asking the right kind of questions. Tinian, 6 weeks later, looked like a different campaign from the sea. The landing beaches were smaller than expected, the approach more daring, the first hours cleaner than men had feared. Staff officers who wanted to believe in speed found plenty to encourage them. The island seemed more manageable. The Japanese appeared thrown off balance. Lieutenant Nakamura listened to the first messages in his cliff chamber and did not argue with any of that. Let them believe the landing had unbalanced the whole defense. The beaches were not the point. The coral interior was. He moved his finger along a chalk line marking galleries through the cliff system and gave the same order Harada had once given on Saipan. Wait! Corporal Joe Mendez first saw the Tinian cliffs from the base of a rise that looked too steep to matter. The map said the Japanese had defensive positions somewhere along the face. The cliff itself looked scarred and uneven, cut with shallow recesses and broken shadows. Marines ahead had already fired grenades into one dark opening, without result. A tank was being brought up, though no one seemed sure what it would be able to see from below. Joe carried satchel charges and kept staring at the shadows. A cliff face should have looked solid. This one looked inhabited by possibilities. He asked the man beside him, "You see where they are?" The other Marine shook his head. "That's what worries me." Nakamura had no ambition to duel with American tanks frontally. His defense depended on misdirection, not bravado. Visible damage along the cliff mattered very little if the firing apertures remained hidden until the Americans committed themselves at the base. His men had worked narrow chambers into the coral, where guns could fire briefly and withdraw. The real defense existed in timing and connection. A mouth here, a slit there, a crawl passage between, a reserve crew one level back. He listened to the tank rounds strike the cliff face below. Coral chips rattled down into the scrub. The Americans were firing at the wall. The wall was not the system. Joe Mendez expected the tank to settle the argument. Instead, it complicated it. The first round hit an obvious recess and filled the area with dust. No return fire. The second hit higher, and still nothing came back. Men began shifting forward. A lieutenant looked ready to send a squad along the base of the cliff. Joe had already started lifting his charges when rifle fire broke from a crack hidden by the second impact's dust cloud. 2 more bursts came from farther right. The tank had not silenced the position. It had only revealed which parts of the cliff were empty. The men on the ground were learning the same thing on every island. Silence was information, not always the information they wanted. By Tinian, the language in Marine field logs had begun to change. Reports spoke of mutually supporting openings, concealed lateral passages, fire after delay, and positions requiring combined tank demolition treatment. The wording was still improvised, still shaped by whoever survived long enough to write it at the end of the day. Yet a pattern was forming. Caves were no longer being described like bunkers or trenches. They were being described like systems that had to be isolated from their own flexibility. Across units, the same idea kept appearing in rougher phrasing. Don't fight the first hole. Find out what it's connected to. Nakamura saw the Americans start testing the ground beside the cliff rather than the cliff itself. That unsettled him more than the tank rounds. A squad shifted left under covering fire, not toward the obvious opening, but toward a narrow fold of ground that led below one of the side cracks. Another group watched a scrub-filled depression where a hidden mouth might allow escape or lateral movement. Engineers were somewhere behind them with charges. The tank had become a gun for holding attention, not the whole attack. He lowered his binoculars. The Americans had not yet mastered cave reduction. They had stopped being simple. On these islands, that was the first dangerous step. Joe Mendez moved in behind the tank and placed his charges under covering fire that had been arranged more carefully than anything he remembered from Saipan's first days. Machine guns covered the upper crack. Riflemen watched the draw. The tank kept firing into the visible opening just often enough to keep heads down. Joe set the satchel, pulled back, and felt the blast crack through the coral face. The main mouth collapsed. Someone yelled for the assault squad. Before they could move, another opening farther right spat fire into the slope and sent everyone flat. The cliff was still arguing. The Americans still did not know how many mouths belonged to one chamber, or how many chambers to one cliff. The answer began arriving not from infantry alone, but from accumulated irritation. A cave mouth could be collapsed. Another could open. A flamethrower could burn one chamber. A support slit could remain. A tank could hit the visible face all day and still never touch the gallery behind it. By the end of Tinian, officers up and down the chain were recording a conclusion, nobody phrased exactly the same way. A cave position was rarely the opening in front of you. It was the set of relationships behind it. That conclusion would travel with every survivor into the next campaign. Peleliu, September 1944. The first thing some Marines noticed was the heat. The second was the smell of coral dust hanging over the ridges after bombardment. The third came only when they moved inland. The island had no interest in behaving like a normal battlefield. Umabrogel was not one ridge or one hill mass, but a contorted complex of uplifted coral ridges, cracks, sinkholes and compartments that gave Japanese engineers exactly the kind of broken, layered ground they needed to build something worse than a line. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa stood inside that fortress and looked at his map with satisfaction. This time the caves did not merely support the defense. They were the defense. Louis Chesty Puller's Marines entered the ridges expecting hard fighting. They did not yet expect a siege. Captain Haynes, back in the line, studied the coral maze through field glasses and could not make the terrain stay still in his mind. Every ridge seemed to hide another behind it. Every cut opened toward some darker fold. Nothing offered a clean crest or a clean objective. The bombardment had stripped vegetation in many places, but bare rock only made the geometry crueler. A staff officer beside him muttered, "Looks dead." Haynes kept looking. "No," he said, "it looks patient." Nakagawa had built his defense with a colder ambition than the beachline commanders of earlier battles. He did not need the Americans thrown into the sea. He needed them fed into compartments. One platoon pinned here, a company stalled there. A tank, forced to expose itself on one ridge, while hidden anti-tank guns waited from another angle. The ridges of Umabrogel offered something the Japanese had been reaching towards since Saipan, not simply protection from bombardment, but a whole interior battlefield where every Marine advance could be split, channeled, observed, and hit from more than one chamber. He pointed to a section of the map and told a battalion commander, "Make them spend the afternoon for 50 yards. Joe Mendez had survived Tinian long enough to notice the difference immediately. Saipan had hidden its caves in the island. Peleliu had turned the entire interior into one interlocked cave problem. By noon of the first hard day in the ridges, Joe had seen Marines pinned by fire from an opening no one could approach, watched one tank hit a coral face until the whole front of it came loose without silencing the slit above, and carried sandbags into ground too hard to dig. The ridges did not permit ordinary assault habits. Men who rose too early got cut down. Men who hugged too close to one face found fire coming from another. The island did not punish mistakes, it manufactured them. Marine artillery liaison officers began noticing a pattern they disliked. Shelling stripped brush. It shook dust loose. It obscured apertures temporarily. It rarely finished them. Some positions could only be damaged by direct fire at short range into the actual mouths. General bombardment, however fierce, was still working across surfaces while the Japanese fought from within compartments and behind angles. The artillery was not useless. It remained essential for suppression, isolation, and pressure. But the ridges were making one thing plain: no amount of offshore violence could replace the last few hundred yards. Those yards belonged to tanks, engineers, flamethrowers, and infantry who were learning a new trade under fire. Sam Velez arrived in Umabrogel and found himself no longer treated like a special asset. He was part of the routine now, and the routine was grim. A tank commander needed a lane. Engineers needed cover. Infantry needed one opening watched while another was hit. Flame came when the sequence was ready. Sometimes, Sam envied his own earlier ignorance. Back on Saipan, every cave had seemed like a separate surprise. Here the surprise was gone. The work remained. He knew before he reached each new position that the visible mouth would never be the whole story. On Peleliu, nobody believed in single stories anymore. Nakagawa listened to reports from forward cave commanders and smiled when they described the same thing. American tanks firing at one face, while riflemen searched the wrong cut. Flamethrowers burning one mouth, while reserve crews waited behind another turn. Infantry trying to rush what looked like a dead cave, only to take fire from a support chamber uphill. The Japanese colonel had no illusions left about ultimate victory. He had something more useful at Peleliu, a defense that converted the Americans' greatest strength, momentum, into vulnerability. As long as they kept trying to move like attackers in a normal battle, the ridges would keep paying him back. Joe Mendez spent an afternoon carrying sandbags toward a position that could not be approached any other way. The coral was too hard for foxholes, the slope too exposed for crawling without cover, so the Marines built cover forward by hand, bag by bag, from a line farther down the draw. It felt absurd and deeply serious at the same time. He had imagined battle as movement. Here, battle was labor under observation. At dusk, a flamethrower team used that bagged approach to reach a cave mouth that had held up the line all day. The mouth went quiet after the burst. An hour later, fire started again, from the same ridge 40 feet higher. Nobody cursed. By then, the pattern was familiar. Peleliu forced Marine commanders into a slower grammar. Battalion journals from the ridge fighting were full of words like reduced, sealed, covered, direct fire, approach cut, and engineer work under protection. A few weeks earlier, many officers had still spoken instinctively about taking hills and driving through strongpoints. Ammerbrogel wore those verbs down. The ridges did not yield to verbs like rush. They yielded to sequences: a squad to screen, a tank to hit, a flamethrower to force withdrawal, an engineer to seal, a dozer to alter, another squad to watch the side opening no one trusted. This was not a theory. It was survival learning its own language. The dozers changed the ridges in ways Nakagawa had not fully expected. He had accounted for artillery. He had accounted for tanks as mobile direct fire support. He had accounted for flame as a horrifying but local threat. The engineer dozers introduced something different. They changed approaches. One machine could create a path into a box canyon where none had existed. Another could push rubble into a lower opening while tanks suppressed the upper slits. In one sector, repeated direct fire loosened an entire section of coral face, and engineers turned the rubble into a ramp for a tank to climb into a better firing position. The ridgeline still stood. Its shape no longer belonged entirely to the defenders. Joe Mendez watched a bulldozer work under covering fire and understood why older officers had stopped talking about assault as if it were a single act. The dozer crawled forward in jerks, blade down, while rifles cracked over its engine noise. It pushed coral chunks into one entrance until the opening disappeared under white rubble. Higher up, a tank kept striking a narrow recess at nearly point-blank range. To the right, machine gun crews cut across a shallow draw where anyone escaping deeper chambers might try to reappear. No one charged. No one had to. By nightfall, the complex that had blocked movement for 2 days was not conquered in any heroic sense. It was denied. Nakagawa's position reports became more careful as the battle stretched. He was still drawing blood, still holding ridges that should have fallen faster, still forcing the Americans to work at a pace that offended their own expectations. Yet the attacks were changing. They were less emotional, less eager to trust that silence meant success, more willing to spend hours arranging direct fire, smoke, demolitions, and engineer movement against one compartment. That worried him. The cave defense remained strongest against impatience. A patient enemy made every chamber smaller. He told one battalion commander, "Kill their time." The battalion commander answered, "They are learning to spend it." By late Peleliu, Marine headquarters was receiving reports that sounded less like field improvisation and more like the outline of a method. Engineers preparing paths for tanks into coral cuts. Direct fire artillery moved close to hit cave mouths from flat angles. Flame used alongside demolitions instead of as a standalone miracle. mortars stripping brush from suspect openings, infantry advancing in squads or small platoons rather than broad exposed lines. One account described fuel lines extended forward so burning fuel could be pushed deeper into defended areas. No one in the command tents was mistaking this for an easy answer. They were watching an answer assemble itself. On one ridge, Sam Velez refused to move until a second cave slit was covered. The lieutenant in charge was young enough to still resent delay. "We're losing daylight." Sam kept his eyes on the rock face. "There's another hole watching the mouth." "I don't see it." "You won't," Sam said, "until I light this one." The tank commander backed him. A second machine shifted slightly and put a round into the darker seam above the main opening. A flash of return fire answered from exactly there. No one spoke for a second. The lieutenant looked at Sam, then back at the ridge. The old battlefield still existed. It simply no longer rewarded the first impulse. Iwo Jima, February 1945. The island looked flayed open from the sea. Months of planning had gone into the assault, and the bombardment had been intense enough to leave observers ashore and afloat with the same private hope Marines always carried after enough shelling. Nothing organized could still be functioning under all that. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had arranged his defense around that hope. He abandoned the cult of the sure death charge and built instead for depth, concealment, and endurance. Tunnels linked positions. Firing chambers sat behind rock. Guns waited until the beaches were crowded. Suribachi drew the eye. The underground system held the island. When the first marine waves landed, the black ash offered no cover and no quick explanation, only waiting. Ben Calloway, carrying radio batteries and half buried in volcanic sand by the time his unit got inland, remembered the first clear burst of Japanese fire, less for its sound than its timing. The beaches had filled, vehicles had stalled, men had bunched. The mountain and the northern lines had allowed all of it to happen. Only after the beach itself had become a target worth harvesting did the island truly open. Kuribayashi's gunners and riflemen were not fighting on instinct. They were fighting on sequence. That made the first hours on Iwo feel colder than earlier landings, as if the island were less enraged than calculating. Inside the tunnel system, Warrant Officer Saito moved from chamber to chamber, carrying updates between companies that could no longer trust visual contact. Beach sectors crowded. American vehicles immobilized in ash. Artillery and machine guns firing to plan. Limited damage from bombardment in some deep sections. Heavy damage in certain exposed positions. Saito had expected violence. He had not expected the strange calm underground, while the beach above dissolved into smoke and movement. Kuribayashi's design did not depend on one line holding. It depended on enough hidden pieces continuing to function after every apparent disaster. The bombardment had not erased the defense. It had only erased the parts visible from offshore. The Marines on Iwo found themselves facing the mature form of the Pacific cave problem. A position hit by tanks might reopen from a connected chamber. A cave sealed on one side might feed another firing slit farther up the slope. Flamethrowers could neutralize a mouth and still leave a tunnel branch active. Infantry could secure the ground in front of one objective and take fire from the ground beneath the next. The island seemed built around delay in every direction. Ben heard a platoon sergeant mutter into the volcanic dust, "It's all connected." No one contradicted him. By Iwo, that sentence had become less a fear than a working assumption. The armored flamethrower tanks, the Zippos, climbed into that assumption like machines meant to have been there all along. A Sherman with flame did not eliminate uncertainty. It reduced exposure. Where a man-portable operator had to close dangerously, the tank could reach farther and survive longer. It could strike cave mouths, bunker recesses, and cut slopes under armor, forcing defenders deeper or disrupting their use of the chamber. Combined with direct gunfire, it became one of the few tools that could press a fortified opening hard without sacrificing infantry to every approach. Ben watched one take position against a cave line and saw the infantry around it react like men who had finally received a reply in the enemy's own language. Saito had been told what American flame tanks could do. Watching one work was another matter. The first gun round hit a firing slit and shattered loose rock around it. A second round followed. Then the flame came, not as a sudden burst, but as a held stream that filled the mouth and kept filling it. The defenders in that chamber did not simply die or live, they lost their timing. Some fell back into deeper galleries. Others shifted toward alternate routes that were already receiving direct fire from another angle. That was the real danger. Flame did not just punish a chamber. It forced movement inside a network the Americans were learning to shape from outside. Iwo Jima exposed another truth the Marines could no longer avoid. No single weapon was going to save them from the underground war. Not artillery, not naval gunfire, not tanks, not flame, not demolitions. The island kept making the same brutal point from different angles. Every tool solved only part of the problem. A gun struck where it could see. Flame reached where it could aim. Charges worked where men could place them. Engineers altered routes where machines could survive. Infantry held the whole arrangement together, with exposure no machine could erase. The answer, whatever it finally became, was going to be a combination, or nothing. Ben spent half a day relaying fire adjustments for a cave line his company could barely see through drifting smoke and volcanic dust. No charge followed. No breakthrough photo opportunity came out of it. Instead, the ridge changed by degrees. One slit stopped firing after a tank and flame attack. Another remained alive until an engineer team moved under cover of machine guns and placed charges at a side opening. A third mouth, thought dead by noon, reopened briefly at dusk and was hit again. The cave complex felt less like an enemy strongpoint than a stubborn machine being shut down component by component. By night, the line had barely moved. The company commander called it progress anyway. Saito listened to the American pattern for several days and understood the threat in it before many of the men above him admitted it openly. The Marines were becoming less eager to confirm success physically, less likely to rush a smoking mouth, less dependent on the visual drama of taking a crest, and more interested in whether the chambers under or behind that crest still functioned. The defenders had once counted on American momentum to create openings. Momentum was still there, but it was colder now, spread out among tanks, engineers, machine guns, artillery, demolition teams, and infantry holding sectors of the same problem. An underground system could survive violence. It had a harder time surviving discipline. Somewhere between Peleliu and Iwo, a request moving through the American system became something more than a request. More mechanized flamethrowers, more engineer support, more close support integration. Field experience had stopped treating these as special adaptations. They were becoming requirements. Seabees and ordnance specialists refined tank conversions. Officers who had once spoken of flamethrowers as auxiliaries now asked for them in numbers. Reports emphasizing dozers, direct fire, smoke, and sealing operations accumulated in headquarters. The islands were writing doctrine in pieces. A commander with the right kind of mind would eventually need to gather those pieces and impose them on a battlefield larger than any before. Pedro del Valle was already moving toward that moment. His career did not make him a legend of cave fighting in the theatrical sense. He was not a flamboyant inventor unveiling one impossible idea. He was an artilleryman by foundation and a Marine commander with a reputation for energy, control, and insistence. He had worked in theaters where firepower, observation, and ground maneuver had to speak to one another or fail uselessly. That background mattered more than a dramatic battlefield anecdote. The Pacific Cave problem did not need another heroic individualist. It needed somebody capable of turning scattered battlefield discoveries into command practice. Okinawa would ask exactly that. April 1st, 1945. On Okinawa, the beaches were almost too quiet. Private Walter Dean moved inland with his company and felt the silence pressing against every expectation he had carried with him. The landing had not become easy. Nothing in the Pacific ever really did. But compared with Tarawa stories, Saipan accounts, Peleliu memories, even the nightmare of Iwo, the first hours seemed wrong in their calm. Vehicles were moving. Men were sorting themselves. Ground was being covered. Around him, relief kept trying to turn into confidence. Far inland, General Mitsuru Ushijima and his chief of operations, Hiromichi Yahara, had arranged for exactly that. The beaches were not the trap. The south was. Pedro del Valle, now commanding the 1st Marine Division, did not read the opening quiet as a gift. He had seen too many islands reward optimism too early. The enemy had not vanished. He had chosen depth, reverse slopes, ridges, tomb complexes, caves, and hidden artillery positions tied into the Shuri defensive belt were waiting to turn open movement into a slower, heavier kind of war. Del Valle's staff maps could show lines and objectives. They could not show how long each cave and each slope would keep its voice. That uncertainty followed every order. The division would move south. The real argument would begin only when the ridges started shooting. Captain Masaru Endo had spent weeks underground before he ever saw a Marine on Okinawa. His chamber sat behind a reverse slope above a line of tombs and cut stone that local civilians had long treated as ordinary parts of the landscape. The Americans would see them too, eventually, and only later understand that the burial ground had been woven into the defense. Endo's men occupied galleries with narrow fields of fire and fallback routes linking to secondary chambers. Ammunition was stacked in dry recesses. Observation points looked through slits, disguised by stone and brush. He had read the reports from Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo with care. The Americans were learning. He intended to find out how much. Walter Dean found his answer on a rainy slope south of the easier landings. Artillery had been working the ridge all morning. Smoke drifted low across the ground. A pair of tanks had fired into one visible opening near a cluster of tombs, and the platoon leader believed the position might finally be ready for an approach. Walter moved with the line, crouched low, rifle tight against his chest, mud on his boots and web gear. Nothing fired for almost a minute. Then the slope answered from the wrong side. Not the opening the tanks had hit, a slit hidden behind a stone face 30 yards left of it. The line went flat in the mud. Okinawa had started. Endo's men had watched the tanks strike the obvious aperture without reacting. The aperture had not been the problem. It had been the invitation. The real firing chamber lay leftward and slightly higher, with a covered link back into the main gallery. When the Marines exposed themselves toward the suppressed mouth, Endo gave a quick nod, and his gunner opened fire. For a few seconds, the old Pacific formula still worked beautifully. The Americans believed the first silence. The position punished them for it. But when Endo studied the slope through binoculars a little later, he noticed something he did not like. The Marines were not withdrawing blindly. They were shifting machine guns to cover the left draw and signaling for engineers instead of rushing the obvious opening again. The rhythm was changing. Del Valle's headquarters was receiving a growing stack of reports that all pointed in the same direction without saying so in the same words. Ridge positions survived bombardment on reverse slopes. Tomb complexes and cave mouths often supported one another laterally. Tanks were effective only when routes, angles, and infantry protection were arranged deliberately. Engineer work was becoming central, not secondary. Artillery still mattered enormously, but increasingly as a means of isolation, suppression, and timing rather than immediate finality. The officers around Del Valle did not need a slogan. The battlefield was pressing one conclusion into them, hour by hour. No single branch was going to defeat southern Okinawa. Leo Kincaid brought his dozer company forward through mud that made every yard feel borrowed. He had worked dozers under fire on smaller islands. Okinawa scaled everything up. The ridges were longer, the weather worse, the defensive compartments more numerous. Tanks needed shelves and ramps. Engineers needed covered approaches. Blocked mouths had to stay blocked, which meant more earth, more rubble, more time under observation. A tank captain walked him to one slope and pointed at a cut in the earth no vehicle could presently climb. "Can you get me there?" Leo looked at the mud, the shell holes, and the line of tombs above. "If your guns stay awake," he said, "I'll try." Endo heard the dozers before he saw what they were doing. Engine noise carried strangely over wet ground. Artillery had been expected, tanks too, even flame if it came. But the dozers made him uneasy in a different way. Shelling and tanks usually attacked what already existed. Bulldozers altered what existed. On Saipan and Peleliu that had been bad enough. On Okinawa, with broader slopes and longer fields of work, it threatened something deeper. A cave system ties itself to terrain. If the terrain starts changing under pressure, the cave has to adapt faster than stone was meant to. Endo sent 2 runners to confirm the American route building. Only one came back. Walter Dean watched the first dozer shelf completed under rain and tank fire and realized the machine had done more to change the fight in an hour than his platoon had managed in half a day. The tank moved up onto the new cut, steadied, and fired directly into a slit above the tomb line from an angle impossible earlier that morning. Another tank covered a shallow depression farther left, where a side exit might appear. Behind them, machine gun teams shifted position and waited. No one in Walter's company acted surprised anymore. The Pacific had taken too many surprises away. They were watching a method now, even if none of them could yet describe it that way. Endo lost the lower slit by noon, not because the Marines stormed it, because they layered it out of usefulness. Tank fire broke the lip, smoke cut observation. Engineers moved under cover and placed charges beside the rubble, already pushed up by the dozer. A flamethrower burst hit the main recess, only after the side depression was covered and the rear tomb line watched by rifles. When the blast settled, the lower slit was no longer part of the battle. The chamber behind it might still exist. The defense around it did not. That distinction would have been academic months earlier. On Okinawa, it was becoming fatal. The 1st Marine Division had not stopped losing men. Every ridge still demanded payment. Every cave line still had hidden surprises. Rain, mud, and enemy artillery wore down even the best-laid arrangements. Yet the tone in field messages began shifting. On earlier islands, cave reports often sounded baffled. Now they sounded procedural. Main aperture covered. Alternate slit active. Dozer route complete to tank shelf. Need demolition on lower gallery. Flame after suppression on right chamber. The mystery had not disappeared. It was being translated. War often changes that way, by turning nightmare into work order. Sam Velez arrived on Okinawa, no longer carrying anyone's illusion that flame by itself ended arguments. He now asked 4 questions before every approach. What can see the mouth? What might be connected to it? Where does the tank fire need to go first? Who closes the gap after I finish? Some young officers thought him cautious to the point of stubbornness. The older ones simply stepped aside and let him build the sequence. On a slope near a rock-cut tomb entrance, Sam refused to move until a machine gun team shifted 20 yards to cover a brush line that looked harmless. When the brush line opened fire, exactly as he expected, nobody argued with him again. Endo had once believed cave defense gave him initiative as long as ammunition and men remained. Now he was beginning to understand how easily a chamber could survive physically and die tactically. A blocked vent forced traffic into another route. A sealed lower exit pushed movement uphill into a tank's field of fire. A tomb entrance, once useful as a reserve path, became useless the moment engineers collapsed the connecting cut beside it. The Americans were learning where the cave lived beyond its mouth. He unfolded the tunnel sketch by lantern light and saw not a fortress, but dependencies. Dependencies can be killed. Del Valle spent enough time close to the front that the phrase, close tactical control, meant something sharper than ceremony. It meant understanding that one ridge could not be reduced by the same pattern as the next if the openings, slopes, and support relationships differed. It meant restraining units that wanted to hurl themselves at a visible mouth because the slope in front of it had already become personal. It meant forcing artillery, tanks, engineers, and infantry into the same clock when rain, casualties, and exhaustion kept trying to knock them apart. The battle in southern Okinawa rewarded commanders who could hold that clock together. Del Valle did. Walter Dean carried ammunition to a tank position one afternoon and listened to the crew talk about cave fighting with a tone that sounded almost like engineering. Need one more round into the vent. Dozer still opening the shelf. Left drawer not covered. Flames got to wait. No one talked about charging anything. No one spoke in the language of sudden victory. The tank had become part of a structure larger than itself, and Walter could feel the entire battlefield tightening around that structure. The cave above them still held. The men below it were already working as if the result had become a matter of sequence rather than nerve. That made the whole slope feel less mysterious. At the same time, Marine artillery on Okinawa was doing what artillery had been struggling toward since the Marianas. Not simply battering, shaping, suppressing one segment while engineers moved elsewhere, smothering reverse slopes long enough to let tanks approach, breaking observation at the exact moment infantry shifted. A barrage in this war was no longer judged only by how much ground it tore open, but by whether the next action could happen because of it. Artillery had always been powerful. On Okinawa, it became punctual. For an officer like Del Valle, trained in its language, that punctuality was more valuable than noise. Endo lost a runner in a side passage and a machine gun recess in the same afternoon. By evening, he had a clearer view than he wanted. The Americans were not trying to clear his cave system one chamber at a time through interior fighting. They were attacking the conditions that made the system useful. A blocked approach here, a cut line there, a tank on a shelf where no tank should have been able to stand. Flame after direct fire, demolitions after flame, infantry holding the spaces between these actions, so nothing reopened behind them. The cave still protected his men from fragments and weather. Protection was shrinking into irrelevance. Marine engineers on Okinawa stopped sounding like support troops in their own field notes. They wrote about access, sealing, ramp cuts, demolitions under cover, collapsed gallery mouths, and routes for armored support in language that placed them directly inside the fight. The cave war had rearranged status. A bulldozer operator could shape the next day's attack as decisively as a rifle lieutenant. A demolition team's timing might matter more than one platoon's courage. Flame, tank, artillery, and engineers now belonged in the same sentence because the battlefield kept putting them there. The islands had forced the Corps into this vocabulary. Okinawa made it permanent. Leo Kincaid's dozer got hit by fragments near the blade while pushing spoil into a low opening cut under a ridge. He shut down, checked the damage, and restarted under covering fire before the tank crews above him had finished cursing. The cave had been active that morning. By afternoon, its lower mouth was buried to the height of a man's chest. The right side slit had been hit by tank fire 3 times, and an engineer lieutenant was waiting with charges for the upper recess once the dozer gave him a little more cover. Leo had long since stopped wondering whether what he did counted as assault work. The cave answered that question every day. Endo's younger officers still talked about making the Americans pay for every yard. They were not wrong. The cost remained high. What changed was the exchange rate. Earlier islands had shown cave defenders how to turn modest forces into strategic delay by exploiting the Americans' need to confirm every gain physically and immediately. Okinawa was eroding that advantage. The Americans still paid. They simply paid more deliberately and collected more reliable results in return. The defense no longer multiplied confusion as effectively. Endo could still hear artillery. He could still hear flame and engines. What he heard less often was marine panic. That absence was dangerous. Walter Dean spent an entire day below a ridge that never looked dramatic enough to justify the trouble it caused. From a distance, it was stone, scrub, and tomb cuts. Up close, it was a set of unseen relationships. The main opening, the side recess, the vent above, the shallow draw below. The route engineers were cutting behind a rise, the shelf where tanks waited, the machine gun line covering one angle, while smoke slid across another. By dusk, the ridge had gone quiet, and stayed quiet. Walter's platoon had advanced less than 100 yards. Nobody called it slow. The island had taught them what speed cost. In headquarters, reports from division and regiment were beginning to carry a calm confidence, absent from Saipan's first days or Peleliu's worst ridges. Positions once described as impossible were now being catalogued by components: main chamber, support slit, lateral access, tomb linkage, reverse slope observation, engineer route required. This was not because Okinawa was simpler. It was because the Americans had finally begun seeing the cave system the way its builders saw it. Not one opening, a set of functions. Once a defender's secret becomes an enemy's checklist, its future shortens. Sam Velez used flame on a tomb cave position, so tightly integrated into the ridge that the entrance looked like part of the masonry. The Marines had already spent hours arranging the attack. One tank hit the visible recess. Another punished the likely side chamber. Riflemen watched the scrub line beyond the tombs. Engineers waited with charges and wire cutters. Only after all of that did Sam move. He sent one stream into the dark entrance and immediately pulled back. Nobody cheered. The engineers went next. The whole attack lasted less than 5 minutes. It had been built all day. Endo heard one of those attacks from inside the galleries as a series of interruptions. A tank round. A second one. A brief roll of machine gun fire across a draw. The low growl of a flame burst. Then the deeper punch of charges. The cave system had once translated enemy actions into time. Time to shift. Time to wait. Time to reopen. The new American pattern translated time against the defenders. Every minute spent under organized reduction narrowed a route, blocked a mouth, heated a chamber, or exposed a reserve cut. Endo had trusted the patience of stone. Stone had not prepared him for the patience of a machine learning quickly. Del Valle's official commendations would later mention tenacity and exceptional leadership. Men on the ridges experienced that in smaller forms. A refusal to let the line waste itself, proving something everyone already knew. A refusal to confuse the noise of bombardment with completion. A habit of pressing for the next coordinated step instead of allowing separate arms to work in parallel without sequence. On Okinawa, command quality lived in such habits. The caves had devoured uncoordinated bravery on earlier islands. They were less comfortable facing arranged persistence. Leo Kincaid once sat on his dozer track in the rain after helping close a ridge complex and looked at the openings across from him. They were still there in a physical sense. Black mouths in stone, broken lips of coral, a vent slit half covered by rubble. Nothing about them had become less forbidding to the eye. What had changed lay in the way the Marines now regarded them. Not as omens, not as miracles, not as special exceptions outside the war's logic. As jobs, hard jobs, specific jobs. That shift, more than any one weapon, had turned the tide. The Japanese still fought with extraordinary endurance on Okinawa. No sequence of American adaptation erased that. Cave systems remained deadly. Reverse slopes remained difficult. Rain remained a collaborator of the defense. Men still vanished on approaches. Tanks still burned. Engineers still died with charges in hand. The underground war did not become gentle, but the battlefield balance had changed at its center. Earlier, the cave had imposed the method. Now the Americans were increasingly imposing one of their own. That change did not remove fear. It reorganized it. The cave was no longer a mystery first and a target second. It was a target shaped by a known mystery. Walter Dean learned more from the questions asked around him than from any speech. Where does that chamber vent? Can the dozer get a shelf here? Which slit watched the last approach? Can smoke hold that drawer? Who covers the rear tomb if flame goes in? Nobody on Saipan had sounded like this at the start. Nobody on Peleliu had sounded like this on the first ridges. The questions themselves proved the core had changed. The caves had once won by forcing the wrong questions. Now they were facing men who had brought the right ones. Endo sent one final request for reinforcement through a runner who never returned. By then, the issue was no longer manpower alone. More men in a chamber with blocked exits and broken links only deepened the confinement. The defense still had courage. It had less room to turn courage into effect. A tomb line with one access sealed and the other watched by tanks might still be occupied by determined soldiers. It no longer influenced the ridge the way it had that morning. Endo folded the tunnel sketch and slid it back into his tunic. The paper still showed a network. The battlefield no longer did. Records kept by Marine units at Okinawa often read with an odd mixture of exhaustion and clarity. A position reduced by tanks, flame, and demolitions. An engineer path cut under cover of direct fire. A tomb complex sealed after repeated attempts to reopen from side apertures. A ridge quiet after gallery access blocked. The language had become clinical because the work demanded it. Grand words were of limited use against a subterranean complex that needed every vent, side cut, and chamber treated with care. Clinical language can sound cold later. On Okinawa, it was another form of survival. Ben Calloway, now hearing Okinawa reports after Iwo, noticed the difference instantly. No one sounded confused in the old way anymore. Tired, yes. Angry, often. Stretched, certainly. But not lost inside the problem. The cave war had stopped being a strange interruption of normal fighting. It had become one of the Pacific War's central professions. Tanks, engineers, flamethrowers, artillery, infantry, smoke, and demolitions were no longer strangers trying to cooperate. They were the team the islands had created by force. The islands had also chosen their exam, Okinawa. Sam Velez looked older than his years by the last weeks of the campaign. Flame had made him famous in the narrow way war makes specialists famous among tired men. It had also taught him to distrust simple stories. He had heard younger Marines talk about the weapon as if it were the final answer. He knew better. Flame closed one phase. It did not command the whole reduction. On Okinawa, the true answer lay in how seldom he was sent forward alone. There was always artillery before, or tanks beside, or engineers after, or machine guns covering the angle he could not watch himself. The weapon had become stronger because it had become less solitary. Endo spent his last fully coherent evening underground, listening not for gunfire, but for engines. Tanks could be endured. Artillery had always been there. Engines meant movement of ground. Dozers, transport, the physical rearrangement of approaches. He had come to fear that more than shelling because it suggested the Americans had reached the stage of a battle where they no longer merely attacked his position. They were constructing the next one around him. An underground defense thrives when the attacker lives in the present danger. It starts to die when the attacker can build tomorrow's angle under today's fire. Del Valle had not invented every component of the Okinawa method. He did something harder. He insisted on it when fatigue, weather, casualties, and impatience tempted units to abandon sequence and trust volume or courage alone. A division commander could not personally place every demolition charge or choose every tank shelf. He could create the climate in which those details mattered more than rage. On southern Okinawa, that climate proved decisive. The 1st Marine Division did not glide through the caves. It kept turning them from positions into problems, and problems into procedures. That was command, translated into ground. Walter Dean helped carry wounded men off a slope one morning, and ammunition up the same slope that afternoon. The ridge ahead had looked almost unchanged all day. Only by evening did the shape of the work reveal itself. One side cut blocked, a vent struck in, a tomb wall breached, a tank now sitting where no vehicle had stood at dawn, a lower mouth buried under pushed coral and mud. The cave complex remained physically there, but anyone who had watched since morning could see the difference. The ridge was no longer choosing the fight. The Marines were. Endo's final position should have been strong enough to hold longer. Months earlier, he would have trusted it completely. On Okinawa, strength depended on more than thickness of rock. It depended on support, movement, venting, observation, and the attacker's willingness to keep confirming danger on the defender's terms. One by one, those conditions disappeared. The lower route collapsed. The left slit stayed under tank watch. Engineers closed the side cut. Flame entered where the chamber had once breathed safely. Marines did not rush the ruin. They watched it. The silence afterward lasted longer than Endo believed possible, long enough to understand, long enough to know the cave was no longer part of the battle. The Pacific Cave War had begun, with mountains surviving bombardment. It ended with mountains still standing and yet somehow defeated anyway. That difference did not come from one miraculous weapon or one act of courage large enough to eclipse the rest. It came from accumulation. Saipan's shock, Tinian's adjustments, Peleliu's siege logic, Iwo's disciplined underground maze, Okinawa's scale. Across those islands, the Marines learned that underground defense could not be answered by treating the visible opening as the enemy. The enemy was the relationship between openings, chambers, slopes, timings, and support routes. Once that relationship became visible, the caves started losing the future. Leo Kincaid drove his dozer through mud near the end of the campaign and past a ridgeline where several blocked mouths stared back from white coral and dark stone. The machine's engine ran rough from weeks of use. Nobody would remember its serial number. Nobody would paint its silhouette on a recruiting poster. Yet Leo suspected, correctly, that machines like his had done something the fleet offshore never could. They had reached into the geometry of the defense itself. A battleship could crush the face of a mountain. A bulldozer could ruin the cave's relationship to it. One was power. The other was adaptation. By Okinawa, adaptation had become the heavier force. Sam Velez saw a young replacement staring at a cave mouth the way green men used to stare on Saipan. with superstition, trying to form inside the fear. Sam pointed with the nozzle. "Not the hole," he said. The replacement looked at him. "The place around it." That was all. No lecture. The young Marine nodded, not because he fully understood, but because on Okinawa, everyone eventually did. The cave never lived alone. There was always another slit, another chamber, another gallery bend, another approach problem, waiting behind the obvious thing. Once men learned to think that way, the caves stopped feeling impossible. They started feeling expensive. There was a difference. Endo's last surviving signalman wrote his final note on the back of an ammunition carton. "Lower access blocked. Air poor. Americans using tanks and earth-moving machines to close all routes. No movement possible to adjacent chamber. Ammunition still present. Water nearly gone." The message never left the chamber. It did not need to. Everything necessary was already there. The cave had protected the men inside from immediate destruction. It had not protected the defense from becoming irrelevant. Months earlier, such a sentence would have sounded absurd. On Okinawa, it was simply what happened when a strongpoint stopped functioning as a system. The men who survived the campaign did not come away speaking of caves with awe. They spoke of them with respect and procedure. They remembered how long they could remain dangerous, how deceptive destroyed ground could look, how many tools had to be brought into one narrow place, and how often engineers mattered as much as riflemen. The romance had drained out of the problem by necessity. What remained was one of the war's hardest truths. Some defenses are not beaten by being hit harder. They are beaten by being understood more completely than their builders expected. That truth followed the Marines out of Okinawa and into every later study of fortified underground war. Pedro del Valle's name attached itself to that final stage, not because he stood alone, but because he commanded at the point where the learning held. Earlier islands had discovered pieces. Okinawa assembled them under pressure that never eased. The division he led fought through one of the Pacific War's densest cave and reverse-slope defenses, using tanks, artillery, engineers, flamethrowers, smoke, demolition, and infantry in a sequence the Corps had not possessed whole in 1943. A commander cannot invent every tool in such a method. He can make sure the method survives contact. Del Valle did. By the time southern Okinawa began to unravel, the Japanese underground defense had not become weak. It had become knowable. That was enough. The next cave could still kill. The next ridge could still pin a battalion for hours or days. The next tomb complex could still demand tank shelves, engineer routes, and flame under fire. But none of those positions any longer carried the old promise that they would remain outside ordinary military answer. The Americans had forced them inside doctrine. Once there, the mystery kept shrinking. An underground fortress is most dangerous before the enemy understands its habits. After that, its stone remains the same. Its advantage does not. Walter Dean stood on a quiet ridge after one of the last reductions and looked at the blocked mouths in the coral. The mountains still stood. The tombs still stood. The cut slopes still showed the black scars of apertures and vents. Nothing in the landscape announced a dramatic ending. No great collapse had taken place. Only the absence of fire. Only the absence of the old uncertainty. No one on that ridge had stormed a legend. They had worked until the legend became a task, and the task, finally, was done. Far to the north, years later, staff colleges and war colleges would discuss underground defense with cooler language. Fortified chambers, interlocking fires, engineer reduction, armored flame support, direct fire artillery, sealing operations. But those words came from places like Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo, and Okinawa, where men first met the problem in smoke and rain and coral dust. The vocabulary had to be earned before it could be taught. Pedro del Valle belonged to that earned vocabulary. His Okinawa was not the beginning of the answer. It was the moment the answer stopped being uncertain. On Saipan, a mountain had survived 5 battleships, cruisers, carrier aircraft, rockets, and everything the Americans could throw at its face. On Okinawa, the mountains and ridges were still there too. They still took bombardment. They still hid chambers. They still waited. The difference lay in what followed the waiting. No more blind faith in surfaces. No more immediate rush toward the first silent opening. No more separate little battles between branches. The Marines came now with a clockwork of guns, tanks, dozers, smoke, charges, and men who knew which angle mattered next. The mountains survived. Their secret did not. That was how a Marine officer made Japan's cave defenses obsolete. Not by erasing the caves, not by denying the courage of the men inside them, not by claiming some new weapon had solved what ships and aircraft could not. He stood at the point where years of bitter learning became command habit. He led Marines who no longer attacked openings as if openings were the whole story. They attacked chambers, exits, vents, routes, shelves, angles, and support relationships. They attacked the function of the cave, not only its mouth. Once they did that consistently, the underground fortress lost the advantage it had carried from island to island. The mountain on Saipan had fired after the bombardment because the Americans still believed they were fighting what they could see. By Okinawa, they had learned to fight what they could not see. The caves remained dark. The slopes remained treacherous. The chambers remained deep. Yet when the sequence arrived, artillery to blind, tanks to open, engineers to shape, flame to force movement, demolitions to close, infantry to hold, the old magic drained out of the stone. The caves had survived the shelling. Their advantage did not. Somewhere beneath coral, ash and mud, thousands of chambers from those island campaigns still existed after the war in one form or another. Collapsed, flooded, sealed, half open to weather. Cut off from the lines they once fed, physical remains of a defensive idea that had once seemed nearly untouchable. The Americans had not broken that idea by refusing to pay for it. They had broken it by learning how to pay differently. Every island sharpened the method. Every report removed some of the mystery. Every engineer path and tank shelf and blocked mouth turned a fortress into a procedure. The mountains were still there. They no longer decided the war. Walter Dean remembered the first mountain because it would not stop firing. He remembered the last quiet ridge because, after all the tanks, flame, dozers, charges, and waiting, it finally did stop. Nothing about the rock itself had become fragile. Nothing about the weather had become kind. Nothing about the fighting had become easy. Only the question had changed. In 1944, the Marines kept asking how such a defense could possibly survive. By 1945, they were asking which entrance to close first. Between those two questions lay the whole transformation. Pedro del Valle never needed to claim he had solved the caves alone. The islands had already written too many names into the answer. Puller's Marines in the ridges, Shoup's earlier hard lessons about island assault, Holland Smith's wider Pacific command world, tank crews, flame operators, engineers, artillery observers, signalmen, corpsmen, dozer drivers, demolition men, and Japanese commanders whose designs forced adaptation by their own brilliance. Del Valle's distinction lay elsewhere. He commanded where all those threads tightened into one rope strong enough to pull the cave war into a new age. After Okinawa, underground fortress fighting would never again be innocent of what the Marines had learned there. The mountains still stood. It had taken shelling from fleets, fire from tanks, and the slow mechanical pressure of engineers and infantry working in mud and coral. It still stood, but it never fired again.